Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're tackling a really big one, globalization.
It's definitely a hefty topic.
Yeah, and if that word just brings up images of like dense textbooks, don't worry.
Right.
We've actually waded through a stack of really interesting articles, discussions, trying to pull out the most crucial bits.
And the most fascinating ones, hopefully.
Exactly. Our mission here is, well, to give you a clearer, insightful look at what globalization actually means day to day.
From people moving around the globe to, the big ideas behind it all.
Think of this as your shortcut, maybe, to getting a better handle on this complex world we're in.
Absolutely. And the sources we looked at, they offer such a wide range of views. Our job was really to try and synthesize those into key takeaways for you.
Okay, so let's get into it. Maybe start with something concrete, like migration in Ghana. Our sources flag a really significant trend there.
They do. Between 1990 and 2017, the number of international migrants from Ghana jumped hugely.
How much are we talking?
Around 60%. It went from about 1.5 million up to 2.4 million.
Wow, that's a massive increase. What's behind that? What were the drivers?
Well, there are several things going on, often interconnected. Economically, it's often the search for better jobs, higher wages.
The classic pull factor.
Right. And there's data, too. Like in 2017, nearly 40% of Ghanaian migrants in the U.S. were working in service and manufacturing. That points strongly towards seeking opportunity.
Makes sense. But it wasn't only about chasing opportunity, was it? Sometimes it's about escaping something difficult.
Exactly right. Political instability, conflict, those have been major push factors.
Like in the 80s and 90s?
Yeah, the military coups, the political turmoil back then, it definitely pushed people to look for stability elsewhere.
And are there other factors too?
Increasingly, yes. Environmental factors are playing a bigger role. Things like droughts, floods. They can displace people who then need to find safer places to live.
So it's this mix of being drawn away by opportunity and, well, pushed out by difficult circumstances.
Precisely.
What about the impact back in Ghana itself? I mean, what happens to a country when so many people leave?
Yeah, that's crucial. And it's really a two-sided coin.
How so?
Well, on the one hand, for the migrants themselves, it often means better living standards, a better quality of life.
And they send money back. Right, remittances.
Exactly. Remittances can be a huge boost for families and communities back home. But then there's the flip side.
Which is?
The challenge of brain drain. When skilled, educated people leave, it can create shortages of professionals, doctors, engineers, teachers.
Right, which could potentially hold back the country's development.
It's a definite risk.
It really brings up a fundamental question, doesn't it? To what extent can we actually control all this movement? As societies, or even globally?
That's a fantastic question, and the sources suggest, well, it's both controllable and uncontrollable in many ways.
Okay, how is it controllable?
Governments can definitely influence things. Visa policies, for instance, offering relocation assistance. Even just building a strong, stable economy can act as a pull factor, attracting immigrants.
Right, so there are policy levers governments can pull.
They can try, yes, but then...
And you have the big, unexpected events.
Precisely. Natural disasters, wars, persecution. These things force people to move, often regardless of any policies.
People fleeing for safety, essentially.
Out of sheer necessity, yeah. Seeking basic security.
This interplay, you mentioned the reasons people leave, the places that attract them. It sounds like there's a way scholars think about this, a framework.
Yes, absolutely. The push-pull theory is a really useful framework here.
Push-pull, okay.
It basically says migration is driven by push factors, things that make people leave home, like poverty, unemployment, violence.
Okay, the negatives pushing them out.
Right, and then pull factors, things that attract them to a new place, like
Right.
higher wages, better living conditions, maybe more freedom or opportunities.
And both the controllable and uncontrollable things we talked about fit into this.
Exactly. Government policies might be a controllable pull factor, while a war is an uncontrollable push factor. It helps categorize these complex forces.
Okay, that makes sense. So we've looked at people moving, the pros and cons there. Let's zoom out a bit. Our sources also talk quite a bit about the downsides of globalization more broadly, the dark side, if you will.
Yes, it's crucial to look at that too. While globalization has brought benefits, it's not without significant negative consequences.
Like what? What are the main concerns?
A big one is rising income inequality. This seems to hit developing countries particularly hard sometimes, where local businesses just can't compete with huge multinationals.
And what about in developed countries?
There, you often see job losses due to outsourcing, companies moving production elsewhere for cheaper labor, which can lead to real economic insecurity for workers back home.
And it's not just money and jobs, is it? What about the planet?
Absolutely. The environment takes a hit. All that increased production, global shipping, air travel. It means more pollution, more carbon emissions, feeding into climate change.
Right. And then there's the cultural impact.
Yes, that's another major concern. The spread of often Western culture through media and brands can lead to cultural erosion. Local traditions, languages, ways of life can get pushed aside. This is especially sensitive for indigenous communities.
It feels like this push for a single global marketplace can sometimes steamroll over local realities, both human and environmental.
That's a fair assessment based on some of the critiques. Sources also point to potential human rights issues.
How so?
In some developing countries, the pressure for profit might lead companies, or even governments attracting investment, to overlook worker safety, fair wages, or environmental protection.
And the interconnectedness itself can be a risk, right? Financially.
Definitely. Think about the 2008 financial crisis. Trouble started in one part of the global system, but because everything is so linked, it spread rapidly worldwide, causing widespread hardship.
That's a pretty sobering list of downsides.
Yeah.
But the sources also mention taking an objective view. What does that actually mean in this context?
Yeah, the objective view tries to be, well, unbiased, fact-based. It's about understanding globalization as this phenomenon of increasing interconnectedness, countries, economies, people becoming more linked,
Driven by.
primarily by advances in technology, transportation, communication. It's about seeing it as a process without immediately judging it as purely good or purely bad.
So, looking at the data, the trends, what does that objective lens show us?
It highlights things like the huge expansion of international trade and investment, the rise of multinational corporations operating across borders, the integration of financial markets.
Which creates opportunities, but also challenges.
Exactly. Opportunities for growth, efficiency, new markets, but also challenges like intense competition, job displacement in some sectors.
And it includes the movement of people we talked about earlier.
Yes, immigration, cultural exchange. But it also has to acknowledge the unfortunate rise of xenophobia and anti-immigrant sentiment in some places, which is also part of the factual picture.
So the objective view is basically saying it's complex, it has pluses and minuses, and it's happening.
Pretty much. It acknowledges the multifaceted nature of it all. But, you know, even an objective view depends on what data you look at and how you frame it. It's a starting point, not the whole story.
Right. That actually leads us nicely into some of the philosophical discussions. How do ideas about justice, fairness, how do they apply to this globalized world? Our sources bring up John Rawls.
Yes, Rawls, a giant in political philosophy. His whole theory of justice as fairness is really influential.
Can you remind us of the core idea?
He asks us to imagine designing the basic structure of society from behind a veil of ignorance, meaning you don't know what your position in that society will be: rich, poor, talented, not, etc.
So you design it to be fair for everyone, just in case you end up at the bottom.
Exactly. It pushes towards principles that ensure the well-being and equality of all members. And this idea, our sources suggest, can be extended globally.
To think about global citizenship.
Precisely. Extending that concern for fairness, for well-being and equality to all people, regardless of what country they happen to be born in.
So if we apply Rawls' thinking globally, what would that look like in practice?
Well, it would probably mean advocating for policies that try to reduce global inequality.
Like what kind of policies?
Things like promoting fair trade practices, supporting global health initiatives, really tackling climate change collectively since it hits poorer nations hardest.
And supporting basic rights everywhere.
Absolutely. Policies that promote equal treatment and protect fundamental human rights for everyone worldwide. That would be central.
Okay, so given those potential dark sides of globalization we discussed earlier, what kind of good policies could actually help? Policies that, as the sources say, serve both economic and social improvement.
Right. It's about finding that balance. Good policies here aren't just about maximizing GDP. They strategically aim for economic growth alongside social well-being.
Can you give some examples?
Sure. Think about trade policy. It should aim for fair trade, maybe reducing barriers, but
Hmm.
also having mechanisms to protect vulnerable domestic industries or workers during the transition.
Not just completely free trade no matter the cost.
Potentially, yes.
Yeah.
Or investment policies encouraging foreign investment, which can be good, but also having safeguards for local interests and the environment.
What about workers?
Labor policies are critical, focusing on improving working conditions, pushing for better wages, ensuring safety nets, while still allowing businesses to be competitive.
And education.
Huge. Policies that improve access to quality education for everyone,
Got it.
especially for disadvantaged groups. That's key for opportunity.
Environment.
Environmental policies have to be integrated, protecting natural resources, controlling pollution, but doing it in a way that supports sustainable economic development, not just shuts it down.
So the overall goal is spreading the benefits more evenly, creating more opportunities for more people.
Exactly. To try and make globalization work for the many, not just the few.
It definitely sounds like there's a whole movement that feels the current system isn't working for the many. The alter-globalization movement.
Yes, the alter-globalization movement, sometimes called the global justice movement, or maybe more negatively, the anti-globalization movement, though many participants prefer alter.
When did this really emerge?
It gained a lot of visibility in the late 1990s. Think of the protests in Seattle against the World Trade Organization in 1999.
Right, I remember that. So what was it a response to?
It was really a response to that's a good way to put it for many involved, yes. They advocate for a different kind of globalization, one that's more equitable, more democratic, prioritizing people's needs and rights and environmental sustainability.
And they challenged the neoliberal model. What does that mean in this context?
Generally, yeah. They critique the emphasis on free markets, deregulation, privatization policies often associated with neoliberalism. They argue that this approach has led to more inequality, environmental damage, and has weakened workers' rights.
Who makes up this movement? It sounds diverse.
Extremely diverse. It's really a coalition. You have civil society groups, NGOs, labor unions, indigenous rights organizations, environmental activists, student groups, even some progressive political parties align with it.
And what do they do? How do they push for change?
All sorts of ways. Large-scale public protests are one tactic, but also grassroots organizing, lobbying governments and institutions, public education campaigns, and developing and promoting alternative models like fair trade, local currencies, things like that.
Okay. Shifting gears slightly, there was a quote in the materials that really struck me. I know who I was when I got up this morning, but I think I must have been changed several times since then. How does that connect to globalization?
Oh, I love that quote. For me, it speaks volumes about the personal, maybe even psychological impact of living in such an interconnected world.
How so?
Well, think about it. We're constantly bumping up against different people, cultures, ideas, maybe through travel, maybe through the internet, media.
Right, exposure is constant.
Exactly. And that exposure inevitably shapes us, changes us. We might adopt new ways of thinking, new values, maybe even question our old beliefs. Our identities aren't fixed. They're constantly being negotiated and reshaped by these global interactions.
So the boundaries between cultures blur a bit.
They definitely can. There's a lot of blending, mixing. Our own sense of self can feel quite fluid sometimes. That quote captures that feeling of maybe not being quite the same person you were yesterday or even this morning because of these encounters.
It really does.
Yeah.
And it makes you think about the power dynamics involved in all this interaction. The sources made a distinction between de facto and de jure power. Could you break that down?
Sure. It's a useful distinction. De facto power basically means power in fact, or in reality, regardless of the official rules.
Power based on.
Often based on things like wealth, economic influence, military strength, maybe even popular support. It's about who actually has the clout.
Can you give an example in the economic world?
The pharmaceutical industry in the U.S. is often cited. Due to its sheer size, financial resources, lobbying efforts, it holds significant de facto power over health policy, even beyond its formal legal position.
Okay, so power in practice. What's de jure power then?
De jure power is power by law. It's legally recognized, official authority granted by constitutions, laws, treaties, formal documents.
An example there.
A clear one is the Chinese government's control over large parts of its economy. It has the de jure power, through laws and state ownership, to set economic policy and direct state-owned enterprises.
So the key difference is the source, actual influence versus legal authority.
Exactly. De facto is about what is, de jure is about what's written down as legitimate power. Sometimes they overlap, sometimes they don't.
That's helpful. Okay, finally, let's circle back to John Rawls and global justice one last time. The sources mentioned his law of peoples and a model of global citizenship. How do these build on his original ideas?
Right, so Rawls didn't stop at justice within one society. In his later work, The Law of Peoples, he outlined principles for how different societies, or peoples as he called them, should interact justly on the global stage.
What kind of principles?
Things like respecting basic human rights, adhering to the rule of law in international relations, principles of fair cooperation, duties of assistance to societies burdened by unfavorable conditions.
And the model of global citizenship fits in how?
It flows from that. It extends his core ideas of justice and fairness to us as individuals in a global context. The central thought is that we have moral obligations that extend beyond our own borders.
Obligations too.
To promote justice and protect fundamental rights worldwide. To see ourselves not just as citizens of our nation, but as members of a global community with shared responsibilities.
Can you give a couple of concrete examples of what that might mean based on Rawls?
Sure. One area is global distributive justice. This suggests we have some moral responsibility for the fair distribution of the world's resources and the benefits and burdens of global economic cooperation. Think about fair trade again, or aid, or rules around resource extraction.
Okay. And another example.
Another would be around global humanitarian intervention. Now, Rawls was cautious here, but his framework suggests a potential moral obligation to intervene to protect people from the most severe human rights abuses, like genocide or mass atrocities.
But carefully considered.
Very carefully, yes. Guided by principles of justice and fairness, weighing the potential costs and benefits, and respecting the sovereignty of peoples as much as possible. The core idea remains promoting justice and respecting human dignity globally.
Wow. Well, this has definitely been a genuine deep dive. We've covered so much ground
We really have, from migration patterns
to the good, the bad, and the complex of globalization itself.
philosophical takes on justice, the movements challenging the status quo.
Identity, power. It's a lot. It's clear from all the sources, globalization isn't simple. It's this massive, ongoing force.
Constantly evolving and touching pretty much every part of our lives, whether we always notice it or not.
So maybe a final thought for you, listening in, reflecting on all this, and knowing how interconnected our world is.
Yeah.
How do you see your role as a global citizen, maybe?
Yeah, and what parts of globalization, the opportunities, the challenges feel most real or concerning in your own life, your own community?
Definitely something to keep thinking about. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.